What would you do if everything you built, your wealth, your success, your perfect life, came face to face with the one thing you didn't know you'd left behind? Elliot Monroe, a self-made millionaire, returns to his humble hometown on a routine business trip. But in the pouring rain, he encounters something that shatters his carefully constructed world: a struggling woman from his past and a boy with his eyes. A child he never knew existed. What begins as a shocking reunion quickly spirals into a battle for redemption, love, and justice as Elliot discovers the trailer park he abandoned is now under threat from a corrupt developer. Facing the mistakes of his past and a ruthless enemy, Elliot must make a choice: stay in the shadows of regret or step into the light of redemption to fight for the family and community he never realized he needed. Get ready for a gripping journey of second chances, resilience, and the power of fighting for what truly matters. Stay with us. This is a story you won't forget. The hum of Elliot Monroe's car engine echoed faintly within the insulated cabin of his luxury sedan as the rain drummed a rhythmic beat against the windshield. The rain softened the sharp glow of streetlights, transforming the empty road ahead into a hazy golden ribbon. This town, with its familiar corners and quiet streets, felt both distant and unchanged, a relic from a life Elliot had long since left behind. He'd told himself this trip was strictly business. Monroe Acquisitions had recently acquired a struggling housing development company, and Elliot's sharp instincts told him there was potential profit buried somewhere in this small town. That's all it was, just another property deal. And yet, the closer he got to the Cedar View trailer park, the more unease crept in. His grip tightened on the wheel as the narrow lane came into view, the trailer park's sagging fences barely visible in the rain. The rain-soaked earth gave the whole area an air of weariness, as though it too had weathered years of hardship. The sudden motion of a child darting across the street broke his reverie. Elliot's heart leapt as he slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the slick road. He came to a stop just inches away from a boy sprawled in the mud, his small figure illuminated by the car's headlights. Elliot was out of the car in an instant, umbrella forgotten in his haste. The rain soaked his tailored coat as he approached the boy, who was sitting up now, brushing dirt from his knees. Relief washed over Elliot as he realized the boy wasn't hurt. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and guilt. Before the boy could answer, a woman's voice cut through the rain like a knife. "Toby, oh my God, are you hurt?" Elliot turned, the voice striking something deep within him. He watched as a woman hurried toward them, her figure blurred by the rain until she was standing just a few feet away. Recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. "Julia," he breathed. Her rain-soaked hair clung to her face, and her eyes, those fiery, determined eyes he remembered so well, were wide with a mixture of shock and fury. She froze, her gaze flicking from him to the boy and back again. "Elliot." Her voice wavered, but there was no mistaking the edge of distrust beneath it. He struggled to find words. I didn't know you were still here." "Clearly," she replied, her tone cold as she wrapped an arm protectively around the boy. "What are you doing here?" Elliot glanced at the boy. Toby, she'd called him, who was watching him with wide, curious eyes. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but there was something about him that tugged at Elliot's chest. His messy chestnut hair, his piercing green eyes. He felt his throat tighten. He cleared his throat, trying to sound composed. "I was just checking on some properties. Are you okay, Toby?" The boy nodded, his gaze never leaving Elliot's face. "Yeah, I'm fine," he mumbled, though he clung to Julia's side like a lifeline. Julia's stance stiffened. "We don't need anything from you, Elliot." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. "I wasn't offering anything," he replied evenly, though the pang of guilt in his chest said otherwise. Julia said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned, guiding Toby back toward the trailer park. Elliot stood rooted to the spot, watching them disappear into the rain. He should have left then, should have driven away, and never looked back. But something about the boy, about Toby, kept him frozen in place. Elliot watched Julia and Toby retreat into the dimly lit trailer park, the rain soaking through his coat as he remained standing by his car. The world around him blurred, the storm a distant hum compared to the storm now raging in his mind. He couldn't leave. Not yet. The decision was impulsive, but Elliot followed them. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he walked past the sagging fences and waterlogged paths. The trailer park was a patchwork of rusting homes, mismatched tarps, and sagging porches, a far cry from the sleek, high-rise world Elliot now inhabited. Julia turned at the sound of his footsteps, her posture rigid. "What do you want, Elliot?" "We need to talk," he said simply. Her laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Talk? About what? The years you've been gone? Or maybe the life you left behind without a second thought?" Elliot flinched. He'd always prided himself on staying calm under pressure, but Julia's words hit a nerve he didn't know he still had. "I didn't know," he said, his voice quieter now. "Didn't know what?" she shot back. "That I was here. That your son was here." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Elliot's gaze shifted to the trailer behind her, where Toby's small silhouette was visible through the rain-streaked window. "I didn't know about him," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Julia's expression didn't soften. If anything, her eyes burned brighter with resentment. "And what would you have done if you did? You were too busy chasing skyscrapers and dollar signs to care about anything else." Her words stung, but he knew she wasn't wrong. The Elliot she remembered had been ambitious, driven to escape the confines of small-town life. And he had succeeded, but at what cost? "I can't change the past," he said, taking a step closer. "But now that I know, I want to help." "Help," she scoffed. "With what?" "A check to ease your guilt." "That's not what I meant." "Then what do you mean, Elliot?" "Because I don't think even you know." The rain fell heavier, soaking through his clothes as her words echoed in his mind. He searched her face for any hint of the warmth he remembered, but all he saw was a woman who had fought too many battles alone. "I mean, I want to be here," he said finally, his voice steady. "For him. For you." Julia shook her head. "It's too late for that." She turned and walked away, leaving Elliot standing in the rain, the weight of her words pressing down on him. For the first time in years, Elliot Monroe didn't have a plan. Elliot sat in his car, the engine idling, as he stared at the glowing lights of Julia's trailer. Rain streaked the windows, but his focus never wavered. The warmth of her home stood in stark contrast to the chill he felt inside his chest. Every instinct told him to drive away, to leave behind the confrontation and guilt gnawing at him. Yet, something deeper, the unanswered questions, the boy's face, kept him rooted in place. He finally stepped out, clutching an umbrella. The rain had lessened, though puddles still dotted the uneven gravel. The trailer door creaked open before he could knock, revealing Julia's silhouette. Her arms were crossed, her expression guarded. "You're still here," she said, the weariness in her voice undeniable. "Why?" Elliot hesitated, wiping the rain from his face. "Because I can't leave things like this." Julia sighed and stepped aside, reluctantly motioning him inside. The trailer was modest, its furniture worn but clean. It smelled faintly of lavender, and children's drawings covered the fridge. Elliot's gaze lingered on a picture of Toby and Julia, the boy's wide grin so eerily familiar it made his chest ache. "You've got 5 minutes," Julia said, leaning against the small kitchen counter. Her tone left no room for negotiation. "Say what you need to say and go." Elliot nodded, taking a seat on the edge of the couch. He tried to organize his thoughts, but everything felt tangled. Finally, he just spoke. "I didn't know about Toby. I didn't know you were still here, struggling like this. But now that I do, I want to help." Julia laughed bitterly. "Help? You keep saying that, but what does it mean? A check? Some grand gesture to clear your conscience?" "No," Elliot said firmly, standing. "I want to be in his life. I know I've been absent, but I don't want to make the same mistake twice." Julia's expression softened for the briefest moment before hardening again. You don't just get to show up and play the hero, Elliot. Toby doesn't need a part-time father who's here when it's convenient. I'm not here out of convenience, Elliot snapped, his voice rising despite himself. I'm here because I can't ignore this. I won't. Julia flinched at his tone, but before she could respond, the sound of small footsteps interrupted them. Toby stood in the doorway, clutching a blanket, his eyes wide. Mom, what's going on? Julia's face softened as she crouched down, opening her arms. It's okay, sweetheart. Go back to bed. But Toby's gaze shifted to Elliot. Is he mad at you? Elliot's chest tightened. He knelt, lowering himself to Toby's level. No, buddy. I'm not mad. I just want to talk to your mom. Toby looked between them, his brow furrowed. Are you going to stay? Elliot hesitated, glancing at Julia. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders was obvious. For a little while, Elliot said finally, If that's okay. Toby nodded slowly, then turned and padded back to his room. Silence filled the space as Elliot straightened, meeting Julia's gaze. You've complicated things enough for one night, she said quietly. You should go. Elliot opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. Fine, but this isn't over, Julia. I'm not walking away again. He left before she could respond, the weight of her silence following him into the rain. The next morning, Elliot stood outside the Cedar View Trailer Parks Community Center, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He had barely slept, his mind racing with memories of Julia and the boy he now knew was his son. He didn't expect her to meet him here, but he had sent a text anyway. Now, as the minutes dragged on, he began to question if he had crossed a line. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Julia approached, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets, her expression wary. She stopped a few feet away, eyeing the coffee. I didn't agree to this, she said flatly. I figured you wouldn't, Elliot replied, offering one of the cups. But I thought you might need this anyway. She hesitated before taking it. You don't give up easily, do you? Not when it matters, he said. And this, Toby, matters. Julia sighed, looking away. The morning sun filtered through the gray clouds, casting a faint glow over the dilapidated trailer park. You don't get it, Elliot. It's not just about showing up. Toby doesn't even know who you are. He's lived his whole life without a father. I know I can't undo that, Elliot said quietly. But I can start being here now. Let me prove it to you. And what happens when you get bored of playing family? Julia asked, her voice sharp. When the novelty wears off, and you're back to your skyscrapers and boardrooms. Elliot met her gaze, his expression serious. That's not who I am anymore. I've made mistakes, Julia, but I'm trying to fix them. For a moment, Julia said nothing. Then she sighed and took a sip of coffee. If you're serious about this, you're going to have to earn it. And not just from me. From Toby. Elliot nodded. I will. Julia looked at him, studying his face as though searching for cracks in his resolve. Finally, she stepped back. We'll see. The conversation ended there, but it was enough for Elliot. It was a start. Elliot parked his car in front of the Cedar View Trailer Park once more, his nerves fraying as he rehearsed what he might say to Toby. Despite Julia's cautious words, he had taken her gesture as an invitation, a tentative one, but an invitation nonetheless. Now he stood on shaky ground, unsure how to begin mending the years of absence. The trailer door creaked open, and Julia stepped out, her arms folded and her face guarded. Behind her, Toby peeked out curiously, clutching a small soccer ball. Elliot's heart skipped at the sight. What are you doing here, Elliot? Julia asked, her voice sharp but lacking the venom of the previous night. I was hoping to spend some time with Toby, Elliot said, his hands stuffed into his pockets. If that's okay with you. Julia hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at her son, who looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes. It's not up to me, she said finally, turning to Toby. What do you think, sweetheart? Do you want to hang out with him for a bit? Toby hesitated, his fingers tightening around the ball. I guess. Elliot crouched to Toby's level, trying to ease the tension. I was thinking we could kick the ball around a little. Maybe you could show me how good you are. Toby looked at the ball, then back at Elliot, and finally gave a small nod. Julia's expression softened slightly, though she said nothing, as Toby led Elliot toward a patch of grass near the edge of the trailer park. The makeshift field was uneven, with patches of dirt and tufts of overgrown grass, but to Toby, it seemed like the perfect arena. Elliot followed the boy's lead, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp ground as Toby set the ball down and gestured for him to take a shot. "Let's see what you've got," Toby said, his tone laced with playful confidence. Elliot grinned, relieved by the boy's lightheartedness. He tapped the ball gently with his foot, sending it rolling toward Toby. "Is that all?" Toby teased, easily intercepting the ball and dribbling it past Elliot with surprising agility. The game quickly turned into a lesson, with Toby demonstrating his moves while Elliot clumsily tried to keep up. Laughter broke the tension, and for the first time, Elliot felt a glimmer of hope that he could connect with his son. Julia watched from a distance, leaning against the porch railing. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze lingered on the two figures chasing the ball across the field. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the game wound down, and Toby's energy began to wane. He plopped onto the grass, his face flushed with exertion, and looked up at Elliot. "You're not very good soccer," he said bluntly, though his tone was light. Elliot laughed, lowering himself to sit beside Toby. "No, I'm not, but I'll keep practicing if you teach me." Toby tilted his head, considering the offer. "Maybe." The moment felt fragile, like a thread of connection that could snap at any moment. Elliot glanced toward the trailer, where Julia still stood, watching. He knew this was just the beginning, and that earning Toby's trust, and Julia's, would take much more than a friendly game of soccer. As if reading his mind, Toby asked, "Why weren't you here before?" Elliot's heart sank. He had expected the question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know about you, Toby," he said softly. "If I had, I would have been here sooner." Toby frowned, his young mind working to process the answer. "Mom says you went away because you didn't like it here." Elliot winced. "I left because I thought I needed to. I wanted to do something big with my life. But now I see that leaving was a mistake." Toby nodded slowly, though it was clear he didn't fully understand. "Are you going to leave again?" The question hit harder than Elliot expected. He looked Toby in the eyes, his voice steady. "No, buddy, I'm not leaving again." Toby studied him for a moment, then shrugged. The simplicity of the boy's response tugged at Elliot's heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As they walked back toward the trailer, Julia met them at the porch. She looked at Toby, who grinned and held up the ball. "He's not very good, but I think I can teach him," Toby said proudly. Julia smiled faintly, her eyes meeting Elliot's. There was no warmth in her gaze, but there was less hostility than before. "Thanks for spending time with him," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm happy to," Elliot replied. "If it's okay, I'd like to do it again." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "We'll see." The words were cautious, but they carried a glimmer of possibility. As Elliot walked back to his car, he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The following week, Elliot returned to the trailer park with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were a pair of sneakers, casual clothes, and a brand new soccer ball, a gift for Toby. He'd spent hours debating whether it was too much or too soon, but ultimately, he decided it was a harmless gesture. Julia had begrudgingly allowed him to visit again, but her words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. "You're going to have to earn it." As he approached the trailer, he noticed Toby sitting on the porch steps, drawing in a small sketch pad. His tongue poked out in concentration as he carefully shaded what appeared to be a soccer field. "Hey, champ," Elliot said, stepping closer. Toby glanced up, his eyes lighting up briefly before he masked his excitement with nonchalance. "Hey." Elliot set the bag down and pulled out the new soccer ball, tossing it lightly to Toby. The boy caught it, his expression shifting to one of pure delight. "Whoa, this is awesome," Toby exclaimed, running his fingers over the glossy surface. "I thought you could use an upgrade," Elliot said with a smile. "And maybe teach me how to actually play this time." Toby grinned, hopping to his feet. "I'll try, but you're gonna have to practice a lot." Julia's voice called out from inside the trailer. "Toby, don't go far. Dinner's almost ready." Toby paused, glancing at Elliot. "Can we play for a little bit?" Julia stepped into view, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her gaze flicked to the new soccer ball, and Elliot braced himself for disapproval. But instead, she just sighed. "Fine. 30 minutes, and then you're coming inside to wash up." "Thanks, Mom," Toby shouted, already running toward the patch of grass with Elliot trailing behind. The makeshift soccer session turned into a flurry of laughter and playful taunts. Toby's enthusiasm was infectious, and for a brief moment, Elliot felt like he was a part of something real, something tangible. But as the sun dipped lower, Elliot noticed Julia standing by the trailer, watching them with a faraway expression. When he and Toby returned, she gestured for Elliot to follow her around the side of the trailer, out of earshot. "You're good with him," she admitted reluctantly. "But I don't think you understand how hard this is for me." "I'm trying to," Elliot said earnestly. Julia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "It's not just about you and Toby kicking a ball around. What happens when you get busy with your big city life again? When the novelty of this wears off?" "It's not a novelty, Julia," Elliot said firmly. "I'm here because I want to be, and I'm not going anywhere." Her expression softened slightly, but the tension in her posture remained. "He's getting attached, Elliot. If you hurt him, if you leave again, I don't think he'll recover from it." The weight of her words settled heavily on Elliot's chest. He nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. "I won't. I promise." The next day, Elliot returned to the trailer park with a plan. He had started researching the property's legal status, determined to find a way to improve conditions for Julia, Toby, and the rest of the residents. The sagging fences, crumbling infrastructure, and lack of basic amenities had been gnawing at him since his first visit. He spent the morning walking the grounds, taking notes and snapping pictures. A few curious residents stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "What are you up to?" asked a wiry man with gray hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Just looking around," Elliot replied, "trying to figure out what this place needs." The man scoffed. "It needs a miracle, that's what. You some kind of inspector?" "Not exactly," Elliot said, offering a small smile. "Just someone who wants to help." The man eyed him warily, but said nothing more. As Elliot continued his survey, he couldn't shake the feeling that the trailer park's problems ran deeper than its physical condition. That suspicion was confirmed later that afternoon when he met with a local property lawyer to review the park's records. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Caroline, frowned as she sifted through the paperwork. "It's worse than I thought," she said, tapping a document. "The park's owner has been neglecting maintenance for years, but he's still collecting rent. And there's a pending redevelopment proposal that could evict everyone." Elliot felt his stomach drop. "Redevelopment? By who?" Caroline slid a file across the desk. "Stephen Grant. Name ring a bell?" Elliot's jaw tightened. Stephen Grant was a rival developer with a reputation for exploiting vulnerable communities. If he was involved, it meant trouble. "Can this be stopped?" Elliot asked. Caroline hesitated. "It's possible, but it won't be easy. You'd have to prove that the current owner violated tenant rights. Even then, Grant's lawyers will fight tooth and nail to push the redevelopment through." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had come here to reconnect with his son, but now he was faced with a much bigger challenge. The stakes were no longer just about him and Toby. They were about protecting an entire community. As he left the lawyer's office, Elliot's resolve hardened. He had walked away from this town once before, leaving behind people who had depended on him. This time, he wasn't going to run. Elliot returned to the trailer park with a plan forming in his mind. The news about Stephen Grant's involvement wasn't just a threat to Julia and Toby, but to everyone living there. For years, the residents had endured crumbling infrastructure and neglect, and now they were at risk of losing their homes altogether. The thought left Elliot simmering with anger. He had to act, But first, he needed allies. That evening, Elliot knocked on Julia's door. She opened it cautiously, her arms crossed. Toby peeked around her, his face lighting up when he saw Elliot. "Hey," Elliot began, his tone measured. "Can we talk?" Julia sighed, but stepped aside to let him in. The trailer was warm and smelled of roasted chicken, the faint hum of the television playing in the background. "What now?" she asked, leaning against the counter. Elliot didn't waste time. "The trailer park is in trouble," he said bluntly. "There's a redevelopment proposal in the works. If it goes through, everyone here will be evicted." Julia's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Redevelopment. Stephen Grant is involved," Elliot continued. "He's trying to push it through under the radar. If we don't act now, he'll bulldoze this place and sell it off to the highest bidder." Julia stared at him, her jaw tightening. "Why do you care? You don't live here. You don't have to deal with this." "I care because you and Toby live here," Elliot said, his voice firm. "And because it's the right thing to do." Julia's defenses softened slightly, but her skepticism remained. "What are you planning to do about it?" "I want to rally the residents," Elliot explained. "We need to file a formal complaint, gather evidence of the park owner's neglect, and fight this in court. But I can't do it alone." Julia hesitated, her gaze flickering to Toby, who was quietly watching from the couch. Finally, she nodded. "I'll help. But don't make promises you can't keep, Elliot." Elliot gave her a small, grateful smile. "I won't." The next day, Elliot began knocking on doors, explaining the situation to the residents. Some were eager to join the fight, while others were skeptical of his motives. "What's a guy like you care about us?" asked an older woman named Marcy, her tone laced with suspicion. "Because it's not just about me," Elliot replied. "It's about protecting your homes, your families. You shouldn't have to live in fear of losing everything." Marcy studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll join, but I'll believe it when I see it." By the end of the day, Elliot had a small but determined group of residents willing to stand with him. They gathered in the community center that evening, the room buzzing with nervous energy. Elliot stood at the front, Julia by his side. He explained the plan, documenting the park's neglect, gathering testimonies, and filing a complaint against the current owner and Stephen Grant. "This isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice steady. "Grant has resources, lawyers, and connections. But we have something he doesn't: each other. If we stick together, we can fight this." A ripple of determination spread through the crowd, and for the first time, Elliot felt a spark of hope. The following week, Elliot's plan was set into motion. He worked tirelessly alongside the residents, documenting the park's broken plumbing, exposed wiring, and unstable structures. Julia helped organize testimonies, while Toby tagged along, snapping photos with a disposable camera Elliot had given him. "You're pretty good at this," Elliot said one afternoon as he watched Toby carefully frame a shot of a collapsed fence. Toby grinned. "Maybe I'll be a photographer someday." "You'd be great at it," Elliot replied, ruffling his hair. The boy's laugh was a sound Elliot hadn't realized he needed to hear. But the progress was soon overshadowed by an unwelcome visitor. Elliot was reviewing the day's findings in community center when the door slammed open. Stephen Grant strode in, flanked by two men in suits. His tailored coat and smug expression exuded confidence, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Monroe," Stephen said, his voice dripping with faux charm. "I heard you've been busy." Elliot stood, meeting Stephen's gaze without flinching. "Just helping the residents fight for what's theirs." Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. But let me give you some advice. Stay out of this. It's a losing battle." "The only thing I'm losing is patience," Elliot shot back. "These people deserve better than being steamrolled by you." Stephen's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Let me remind you, Elliot, I play to win. And I always do." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. That evening, Elliot sat with Julia on the porch of her trailer, the weight of Stephen's visit pressing down on him. The sky was dark, the stars obscured by thick clouds. "He's not going to back down," Elliot said quietly. Neither are we, Julia replied, her voice steady. Right. Elliot looked at her, the resolve in her eyes sparking a renewed sense of determination. He nodded. Right. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Elliot poured every ounce of energy into organizing the residents, creating a case that would force Stephen Grant and the current park owner to face accountability. The residents' stories of neglect painted a damning picture. Pipes that burst and were never fixed, roofs that leaked incessantly, and hazardous wiring that turned homes into fire hazards. Toby helped collect photos while Julia worked tirelessly to coordinate meetings. But despite the growing momentum, there were cracks in their unity. Some residents, fearful of retaliation, began to pull back. Why should I stick my neck out for this? Marcy demanded one evening during a heated meeting. Even if we win, what's stopping Grant from finding another way to take everything? We can't let fear dictate our actions, Elliot countered, his tone calm but firm. If we back down now, he wins without a fight. But what if fighting makes things worse? Another resident asked, her voice trembling. Julia stood then, her voice cutting through the murmur of doubt. I've been afraid for years, afraid of losing this place, afraid of not being enough for my son. But you know what's scarier? Letting people like Stephen Grant decide what happens to us without lifting a finger to stop them. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Slowly, the resistance began to dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of determination. Elliot couldn't help but glance at her, a flicker of admiration lighting in his chest. Julia had a strength he had only begun to understand. 2 days later, the first sign of retaliation appeared. The residents woke to find eviction notices pinned to their doors, threatening immediate action if rent wasn't paid in full. Panic rippled through the trailer park as families scrambled to decipher the legal jargon. This is illegal, Elliot said, scanning one of the notices. He's trying to scare us. It's working, Julia said grimly, nodding toward a group of residents huddled near the community center. Their faces were pale, their voices frantic. Elliot clenched his jaw. Stephen's tactics were predictable but effective. He turned to Julia. We need to get ahead of this. Call Caroline. I'll meet with her to figure out our next move. As the day wore on, Elliot worked to reassure the residents, but doubt gnawed at him. Stephen's reach was vast, and this was only the beginning. By the time evening fell, the weight of the battle ahead felt heavier than ever. Elliot's fears were realized that night. He had just settled into bed at the small motel he'd been staying at when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Julia's name, and a sense of dread settled in his gut as he answered. Elliot, Julia's voice was shaky, urgent. There's a fire at the park. Toby and I are okay, but you need to get here. He was out the door in seconds, adrenaline coursing through him. The drive to the trailer park felt endless, the flashing lights of fire trucks illuminating the night sky as he arrived. Smoke billowed from one of the trailers, flames licking at its edges while firefighters worked to contain the blaze. Elliot found Julia standing near the perimeter, her arms wrapped protectively around Toby. The boy's face was buried in her chest, his small frame trembling. Elliot's heart twisted at the sight. What happened? He asked, his voice tight. Someone said it, Julia said, her eyes blazing with fury. There's no way this was an accident. Elliot glanced around, spotting Marcy among the crowd. Her trailer was untouched, but her expression was one of pure devastation. Was it yours? She nodded, tears streaking her face. I wasn't home. If I had been, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Elliot placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out. I promise. Stephen's shadow loomed large over the incident. Elliot knew this wasn't just an act of random vandalism. It was a warning. As the flames subsided and the residents began to assess the damage, he felt a new wave of determination rise within him. Stephen had gone too far. The next morning, Elliot sat across from Caroline in her small office, the faint smell of burnt wood still clinging to his clothes. He recounted the events of the night, his tone grim. We need to tie this to Grant, he said. This has to end. Caroline sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. It's not that simple. Unless we have proof he ordered this, it's just speculation. Then we'll get proof, Elliot said, his voice hard. Whatever it takes. The challenge was daunting, but Elliot refused to let fear deter him. He owed it to the residents, to Julia and Toby, to see this fight through to the end. That evening, Elliot gathered the residents once more. The fire had shaken them, but it had also ignited something powerful, resolve. Standing in the center of the room, Elliot spoke with unwavering conviction. "We've been pushed around for too long," he began. "But this is where it stops. Stephen Grant thinks he can scare us into submission, but all he's done is show us how desperate he is. And desperate men make mistakes." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, the residents exchanging determined glances. Julia stood at Elliot's side, her presence a silent but powerful reassurance. "We're going to fight back," Elliot continued. "Not with fear, but with the truth. And when this is over, we'll show Stephen Grant that he underestimated the wrong people." The fire was the wake-up call the community needed. The next morning, Elliot, Julia, and the residents rallied with renewed energy. Stephen Grant had made his move, but instead of breaking their spirit, he had strengthened their resolve. The trailer park buzzed with activity as residents prepared to fight back. Elliot's leadership was becoming more visible, but it was Julia's unwavering presence that inspired them to believe victory was possible. Elliot spent the day coordinating efforts. Armed with Caroline's legal guidance, he began organizing their evidence into a comprehensive case. Broken pipes, faulty wiring, eviction notices, and now arson. Each piece fit together into a damning narrative of negligence and greed. Julia worked alongside him, her sharp mind and attention to detail proving invaluable. "We need to focus on tying this to Stephen," she said, her brow furrowed as she sorted through testimonies. "If we can prove he's behind the redevelopment and scare tactics, it'll destroy his case." "I'm already working on it," Elliot replied. "I have some contacts who might dig up more about his connections to the park's owner." Toby, sensing the seriousness of their work, sat nearby with his sketchpad. His drawings had shifted from soccer fields to scenes of the trailer park, smoke rising from Marcy's trailer, children playing near broken fences. Elliot glanced at one of the sketches, his chest tightening at the way Toby captured the community's struggles. "That's really good, buddy," Elliot said, ruffling Toby's hair. "You've got an eye for details." Toby beamed but didn't respond, his focus returning to his pencil. The breakthrough came late in the afternoon. One of Elliot's contacts, a former employee of Stephen Grant, reached out with critical information. "The guy's been shady for years," the man explained over the phone. "He uses shell companies to buy properties under the radar. Once he's in control, he lets the conditions deteriorate until the tenants are desperate to leave. That's when he swoops in with redevelopment plans." "Do you have proof?" Elliot asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I might have something. Grant's emails, financial records, enough to make him squirm. But I'll need to dig up." "Do it," Elliot said without hesitation. "And send me everything you find." The call ended, leaving Elliot both hopeful and anxious. He shared the news with Julia, whose eyes widened. "If we get those records, it could be the nail in the coffin," she said. "It's a start," Elliot replied. "But we still need to get the residents on the same page. If anyone wavers now, it could weaken our case." That evening, Elliot called another meeting in the community center. The room was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Julia stood beside him, her calm presence grounding the nervous energy. "We have a lead," Elliot began, his voice steady. "Someone close to Stephen Grant is working on uncovering proof of his illegal practices. If we can get our hands on that, we'll have a solid case against him." Murmurs of hope rippled through the crowd, but Marcy raised her hand. "And what if it's not enough? What if he finds a way to wiggle out of this?" Julia stepped forward, her voice firm. "Then we fight harder. We've already come this far, and we've faced worse than this. Giving up now isn't an option." Her words struck a chord, and the room fell silent. One by one, the residents nodded in agreement. Elliot looked out at the group, pride swelling in his chest. "We'll win this because we're doing the right thing. Stephen Grant is powerful, but he's not invincible. Together, we can stand against him. The residents cheered, their determination reignited. The following day brought an unexpected blow. As Elliot worked on drafting their formal complaint, he received a call from Caroline. Her voice was tense, the words rushing out as though she was trying to soften the blow. "Elliot, I just got word from the park's owner. He's sold the property." Elliot froze. "What? To who?" "Stephen Grant," Caroline confirmed. "The sale went through this morning. Grant now officially owns Cedar View Trailer Park." The news hit like a punch to the gut. Elliot gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "What does this mean for us?" "It means things just got harder," Caroline said. "With him as the owner, he has even more leverage to push the redevelopment forward. But it doesn't mean we're out of options. If we can prove the sale was part of his larger scheme, it'll still strengthen our case." Elliot thanked her and hung up, his jaw tight. He relayed the news to Julia, who cursed under her breath. "He's trying to force us out," she said. "He's upping the pressure because he knows we're getting close." Elliot nodded. "Which means we can't back down. We need to find that proof. And fast." The betrayal shook the residents. Fear and frustration bubbled over during the next meeting, with some questioning whether it was worth continuing the fight. "He owns the park now," one man said. "What chance do we have against him?" "We still have a chance," Julia interjected, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stephen Grant may own the land, but he doesn't own us. We've already shown him we won't go quietly, and that's why he's trying so hard to scare us. It's because he's afraid of us." Elliot stepped forward, backing her up. "Julia's right. This isn't over. If anything, this is proof that we're making progress. Stephen's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. We'll find those mistakes and use them against him." The residents murmured their agreement, though the tension in the room lingered. Elliot knew the fight ahead would be harder than anything they'd faced so far, but he was determined to see it through. As the meeting ended, Julia pulled him aside. "You really think we can win this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Elliot met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Yes, because we have to." The pressure mounted as Elliot threw himself into uncovering evidence to stop Stephen Grant. The atmosphere in the trailer park was tense, but the residents were holding firm. Julia, always the steady presence, kept morale high despite the growing fear. Toby stayed close to Elliot, clearly enjoying the time they spent together, even as Elliot grew more exhausted with every passing day. Then, late one evening, Elliot's contact called with a breakthrough. "I've got the proof you need," the man said. "Emails, financial transactions, even blueprints. It's all here. Stephen's shell companies have been buying properties across the state, using illegal backdoor deals and kickbacks to push through approvals." Elliot leaned forward, gripping his phone tightly. "You sure about this? It's enough to bring him down." "More than enough," the man replied. "But you'll have to act fast. Grant isn't stupid. He'll try to cover his tracks once he catches wind of this." Elliot thanked him and immediately called Caroline to relay the news. By the time he hung up, it was nearly midnight, but the adrenaline coursing through him refused to let him rest. He paced the small motel room, his mind racing with the possibilities. They finally had a way to fight back. The next morning, Elliot called an emergency meeting with the residents. The room buzzed with anticipation as he stood at the front, the evidence in hand. Julia sat in the front row, her gaze locked on him, a mixture of hope and skepticism in her eyes. "We have the proof," Elliot announced, his voice steady despite the fatigue weighing on him. "Stephen Grant's entire operation is built on fraud and corruption. These documents show how he's been manipulating the system to push people out of their homes." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as Elliot began laying out the details. Financial transactions linked to shell companies, emails coordinating underhanded deals, and even plans to demolish the trailer park before securing the necessary permits. The evidence was damning. Julia stood, her voice carrying over the crowd. "What's the next step?" "We file a formal lawsuit," Elliot said. "Caroline is preparing the paperwork. Once it's filed, Grant won't be able to move forward without facing legal scrutiny? What if he tries to retaliate again? Someone asked. Elliot hesitated, glancing at Julia. He might. But this time, we'll be ready. We'll involve the media, shine a spotlight on what he's doing. Grant thrives in the shadows. If we expose him, he'll lose his power. The room erupted in a mix of cautious optimism and nervous energy. For the first time, Elliot saw the beginnings of real hope in their eyes. 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. Caroline submitted the documents to the court, and Elliot wasted no time contacting a local journalist to break the story. Within hours, the first article was published, detailing Stephen Grant's shady dealings and the residents' fight to save their homes. The headline read, "Local developer faces fraud allegations amid trailer park redevelopment controversy." The media frenzy was immediate. News vans descended on the trailer park, reporters interviewing residents about the conditions they'd endured and their determination to stand up to Grant. Julia, ever composed, became the unofficial spokesperson for the community. Her heartfelt words about the importance of family and home resonated with viewers, painting the residents as resilient underdogs fighting against a corrupt system. Elliot watched from the sidelines, his pride in Julia growing with every interview. Her ability to connect with people, to inspire them, was something he admired deeply. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, a black SUV pulled up to the trailer park, and Stephen Grant stepped out, flanked by 2 lawyers. His presence cast a shadow over the celebration, and the residents gathered warily as he approached. "Monroe," Stephen called out, his voice carrying across the park. "Care to explain why you're slandering my name in the press?" Elliot stepped forward, meeting Stephen's glare with calm defiance. "It's not slander if it's the truth, Grant. We have the evidence." Stephen smirked, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "You think you've won? This little stunt of yours won't hold up in court. I've dealt with worse than you." "You've never dealt with all of us," Elliot replied, gesturing to the gathered residents. "And we're not backing down." Stephen's expression darkened, and for a moment, Elliot saw a flicker of doubt in his rival's eyes. Without another word, Stephen turned and climbed back into his SUV, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. As night fell, Elliot and Julia sat on the porch of her trailer, the distant hum of the media vans a reminder of the battle ahead. "He's not going to go down without a fight," Julia said, her voice quiet. "I know," Elliot replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But neither are we." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "You've changed, you know. The Elliot I knew would have walked away from all this. The Elliot you knew was a fool," he said with a faint smile. "But I'm not walking away again. Not from you. Not from Toby. Not from this." Julia didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said everything. For the first time, Elliot felt like he truly belonged, not just to the fight, but to the family he had unknowingly left behind. The media frenzy surrounding the lawsuit had put Stephen Grant on the defensive, but it also painted a target on the Cedar View community. Over the next week, the trailer park buzzed with reporters and activists offering support, but the tension among the residents was palpable. They knew Stephen wouldn't go down quietly, and the first sign of his retaliation came quicker than expected. Elliot was working on case updates with Caroline when Julia burst into the room, her face pale. "They shut off the water," she said, her voice tight with fury. "And the power. No warning, no explanation." Elliot slammed his pen down. "Grant's trying to force us out." Caroline leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "That's illegal. Landlords can't just cut utilities as a means of eviction, but proving it's intentional could take time." "We don't have time," Elliot said, standing. "This is his way of scaring people into leaving before the court date. If we let him get away with this, he'll keep pushing." "We'll get the utilities back on," Caroline assured them. "But you need to keep the residents from panicking." Elliot nodded and followed Julia out. When they returned to the trailer park, chaos greeted them. Families were gathered outside their trailers, voices raised in fear and anger. Marcy waved Elliot over, her face flushed. "What are we supposed to do now?" she demanded. "We can't stay here like this." Elliot raised his hands to calm the crowd. "This is just another one of Grant's tactics. He's hoping we'll give up, but we're not going to let him win. I'm working on getting everything restored, and in the meantime, we'll stick together. Stick together how? Someone shouted. We can't even cook or shower. Julia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. We'll manage, just like we always have. If you need food or water, come to my trailer. We'll figure this out together. Her calm confidence settled the crowd, and the tension began to ease. Elliot caught her eye and gave her a small nod of thanks. She was the heart of this fight, and everyone knew it. That evening, Elliot made calls to local officials and utility companies, demanding immediate action. He pulled every string he could, leveraging his connections to expedite the process. By midnight, the power and water were restored, but the damage had been done. The residents were shaken, and Elliot knew Stephen wouldn't stop there. As he sat on the porch of Julia's trailer, staring out at the quiet park, Toby joined him, carrying a flashlight. Do you think we'll win? Toby asked, his voice small. Elliot looked at his son, the weight of the fight heavy on his shoulders. I think it's going to be hard, but we have a chance. And sometimes, that's all you need. Toby nodded, his flashlight casting patterns on the ground. I hope so. Elliot smiled faintly, ruffling Toby's hair. Me too, buddy. The next morning brought a glimmer of hope. Caroline called with an update. The evidence against Stephen Grant had been reviewed by a local judge, and the case was moving forward. An emergency hearing was scheduled, giving the residents a chance to present their side. This is good news, Caroline said, but it also means we need to be prepared. Stephen's lawyers will come at you with everything they have. Elliot hung up and relayed the news to Julia, whose face lit up with determination. We'll be ready, she said, whatever it takes. Over the next few days, the community came together like never before. Residents practiced their testimonies, rehearsing their stories of neglect and abuse under the park's previous ownership. Julia helped organize evidence, while Elliot coordinated logistics with Caroline. Toby watched from the sidelines, his sketch pad in hand. One evening, as Elliot reviewed documents, Toby handed him a drawing. It was a picture of the community center, filled with people standing together. Above them, a banner read, "We won't be moved." Elliot stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. This is amazing, Toby. The boy shrugged, but a small smile crept onto his face. I just wanted to help. You've done more than help, Elliot said, pulling him into a hug. You've reminded us what we're fighting for. The day of the hearing arrived with a mix of nerves and anticipation. The residents gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and banners that read messages like, "Justice for Cedar View and homes, not greed." Reporters swarmed the scene, capturing every moment. Inside the courtroom, Elliot felt the weight of the residents' hopes on his shoulders. Julia sat beside him, her presence steadying him as the proceedings began. Caroline presented their case with precision, laying out the evidence of Stephen's corruption and neglect. When it was Julia's turn to testify, she stood tall, her voice unwavering as she described the years of hardship the residents had endured. We've lived with broken pipes, leaking roofs, and threats of eviction for too long, she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. But this isn't just about the trailers. It's about the people who call them home. Her words struck a chord, and Elliot could see the impact on the judge's face. Stephen's lawyers tried to discredit her, but Julia held her ground, her quiet strength cutting through their tactics. When Elliot took the stand, he spoke with raw honesty. I walked away from this town once, and it's my biggest regret. But now, I have the chance to make things right, not just for my family, but for this community. Stephen Grant has tried to scare us, silence us, and break us. But we're still here, and we're not backing down. The hearing stretched into the evening, the tension in the courtroom palpable as the judge deliberated. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but clear. Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient grounds to halt the redevelopment of Cedar View Trailer Park pending further investigation. Additionally, the allegations of fraud and corruption against Mr. Stephen Grant will be referred to the appropriate authorities for review. The room erupted in applause, the residents cheering as Stephen sat stone-faced at his table. Elliot turned to Julia, who smiled for the first time in days, her relief evident. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "We all did it." The days following the hearing were a whirlwind of relief and celebration. For the first time in months, the residents of Cedar View Trailer Park felt a sense of security. Stephen Grant's plans were officially halted, and the community began to rebuild, both physically and emotionally. The trailer park wasn't just a collection of homes anymore. It had become a symbol of resilience and unity. Elliot stood in the middle of the park, watching as residents worked together to repair fences, clean up debris, and repaint weathered trailers. Julia was organizing a potluck to celebrate their victory, her energy infectious as she rallied volunteers. Toby darted between groups, his sketchpad tucked under one arm and a soccer ball under the other. "You look happy," Julia said, appearing at Elliot's side with 2 cups of lemonade. "I am," Elliot admitted, taking the cup she offered. "It feels good to see everyone coming together like this." "You should feel good," Julia said, her voice soft. "You made this happen." Elliot shook his head. "We all did. If it wasn't for you and the residents, this park would have been gone. I just helped where I could." Julia smiled, her gaze lingering on him. "Well, whether you admit it or not, you've changed this place, and yourself." Elliot met her eyes, the connection between them undeniable. "I'm just glad I got second chance. With the park, with you, with Toby." Julia's expression softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. But before either of them could say more, Toby ran up, holding his sketchpad. "Look, Mom. Look, Elliot," he said excitedly, flipping to a new page. The drawing showed the trailer park, vibrant and full of life, with people smiling and children playing. Above it, he had written, "Home." Julia crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from Toby's face. "It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It really is," Elliot added, ruffling Toby's hair. "You've got talent, buddy." Toby grinned, his pride evident. "Can we hang it up in the community center?" "Absolutely," Julia said, pulling him into a hug. "It belongs there." As Toby ran off to show the other residents, Julia straightened, her smile lingering. "He's happy. I haven't seen him like this in a long time." Elliot nodded, his chest tightening. "I want to keep it that way." Julia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Then don't leave." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over him. Elliot reached for her hand, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere, Julia. Not this time." Months later, Cedar View Trailer Park looked like a completely different place. The residents had worked tirelessly to transform their homes and their community. With the legal battle behind them, they had secured funding from a local nonprofit to make necessary repairs and improvements. The park now boasted a playground for the children, a repaired community center, and even a small garden maintained by the residents. Elliot had stayed true to his promise, splitting his time between the park and his business in the city. But his priorities had shifted. The ambitious, work-obsessed man he once was had been replaced by someone who valued connection and purpose over profit. Julia and Elliot's relationship had deepened, though they took things one step at a time. Toby, who had once been wary of Elliot, now treated him as if he'd always been there. The 3 of them often spent evenings together, playing soccer, working in the garden, or simply enjoying the quiet sense of family they had built. One evening, the residents gathered for a community barbecue. The smell of grilled food filled the air as children played on the newly built playground and neighbors laughed and shared stories. Toby stood proudly near the community center, showing off his framed drawing to anyone who would look. Elliot watched from a distance, a content smile on his face. Julia approached, handing him a plate of food. "You're staring," she teased. "Just taking it all in," Elliot replied. "It's not every day you get to see a dream come true." Julia followed his gaze, her expression soft. "It's not just a dream, it's a home. And that's because of you. It's because of us," Elliot corrected, his voice firm. "This community came together because they believed in something bigger than themselves. I just gave them a little push." Julia smiled, leaning closer. "Well, whatever it was, it worked," As the sun set over the park, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elliot felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent years chasing success, only to realize that the greatest achievement of his life wasn't a skyscraper or a bank account. It was the family and community he had helped save. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Julia rested her head on his shoulder, and Toby ran up, holding a sparkler. "Look," Toby said, waving the sparkler around. "Isn't it cool?" Elliot laughed, pulling the boy into a hug. "It's perfect." For the first time in his life, Elliot Monroe felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like to support more content like this. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story had the biggest impact on you? Was it the emotional family reunion, the community's fight for justice, or the unexpected twists? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we're always looking for new ideas. What kind of stories would you like to see next? Whether it's tales of redemption, inspiring comebacks, or heartfelt family dramas, your suggestions mean the world to us. Drop your ideas in the comments, and who knows, your story might inspire our next video. Thanks for being part of our storytelling journey.